This part of the animation can be considered as a normal ventricular activity. The rate is reasonable. Now it is going to tachycardia. It's arising from a focus in the left ventricle and spreading to the right ventricle. And the tachycardia rate is rather slow. Now it has gone to fast rate. Initial part you can call it as slow VT or idioventricular rhythm. This is a representation of ventricular tachycardia on the ECG, and the white QRS complexes can be seen. Now it is ventricular fibrillation. The rate is changing, irregular, and you might wonder why there are signals in the atria also. Hold on, I'll tell that with experimental evidence later on. This could be considered as coarse ventricular fibrillation turning to fine ventricular fibrillation with higher rate and lower amplitude. This is a representation of ventricular fibrillation with totally disorganized ventricular electrical activity. This is another representation of ventricular fibrillation, totally different. And finally, this can be either considered as asystole or fine ventricular fibrillation, almost similar. Very fine activity is seen. This is a natural sequence in ventricular fibrillation. Initially, it is coarse ventricular fibrillation. As time goes, it becomes fine ventricular fibrillation. Coarse ventricular fibrillation can be defibrillated easier, while fine fibrillation is difficult to defibrillate. And once you lose that time window, it goes to asystole, which is probably very often cannot be resuscitated. So we have to act fast and get defibrillated earlier. Came across an interesting article on atrial rhythm during ventricular fibrillation in an experimental animal. The impulses from the ventricle conduct to the junctional tissue and retrogradely, but not all impulses will get conducted to the atrium, and there is irregular activation of the atria. Somewhat similar to what happens to the ventricular rhythm in atrial fibrillation. In atrial fibrillation, atria are activated at a fast rate, but all impulses do not cross the AV junction and reach the ventricles, so that ventricular rate is maybe 120 per minute, while atrial rate is around 600 range. So similarly, in ventricular fibrillation, they found that atrial activation is much less than the ventricular rate, or rather ventricular rhythm, and it is totally irregular. Somewhat the reverse sequence of what occurs in atrial fibrillation.